welcome as well. It's been a good couple of weeks, the last couple of weeks. We've had New South Wales win the Origin, the first one, which was good. We've also had the Aussies go down 2-1 to France, but they put up a good show. So it's good to see the Aussies are doing all right. My name's Jeremy Anazelli. I'm from a partner at Glossop Chartered Accountant, organisation run by Munziril and myself. We've been operating as a business over 10 years now, and we've got about 22 years of professional experience between us. We are experienced property investors, and we've got about 23, 24 colleagues now, so we are a big growing family. Tonight I'm looking forward to it because we've put together a really good panel, a panel with a lot of expertise in property, all a little bit of a different view as well. And I'm really looking forward to Ross and Munziril getting up here and asking some of the questions we all want to know, which is how to research property like a pro and how to make a little bit of money. All right, so tonight's agenda, what we're running through is Scott LeCane from Aussie Home Loans. We'll be talking a little bit about the market and giving us a market update using some of the core logic slides. We'll be giving a little bit of examples of data to assist you when you are investing, how to do it, what type of free websites or paid websites there are out there. And then we'll get the panel up here for about 45 minutes, maybe a touch longer. And that's when we're going to ask some really good questions to extract all their knowledge, information. Guys, get your pens and pencils ready. There'll be lots and lots of good tips. Don't forget to ask some questions at the very end. And I'm very excited. And at the very end, we'll look through some examples of properties that maybe they've purchased in the last couple of weeks or last couple of months, and maybe find out why they've purchased those particular properties. And at the end, we'll conclude. So we might bring up Scott to discuss about the market and what's happening.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks, Jeremy. Yes, with tonight's focus being on research, we thought we would do some core logic slides, which is really where we gather a lot of our information. When we're interested in where the market's at, we call on core logic to do property reports or get some of this data in regards to where the market's at, what the experts are saying. So let me dive into it. So obviously, common knowledge is that values are dropping, but just by how much and where are they dropping is what's interesting about this slide. So obviously across the 12 months, the combined capitals have slowed down. But what's interesting is the regional markets have remained quite buoyant through the last 12 months, where the combined capitals have obviously dropped. Sydney's dropped by 4.2%. The stunning, outstanding performer has been Hobart, that's had 12.7% growth in the last 12 months. So I guess it's an interesting fact that we can see that the regionals have continued their growth as a hangover from the growth in the capitals. It's pushed out from the capitals. So that's what I find interesting out of this slide, and that Melbourne still produced a growth in the last 12 months of 2.2%, where Sydney went back by 4.2%. So interesting on the growth. I like this slide. Basically what CoreLogic have done is they've grabbed the national values of properties and divided it into 10 sections. So they've basically taken the cheapest properties are in the first section and the most expensive properties are in the 10th section. And then they've looked at what are those individual performances of those different sections. And what it shows is that the most expensive properties have had by far the largest drop in value. So when we talk about it month in, month out, that there's markets within markets, this is a clear example that the top end of town has dropped large, and the middle is actually performed quite well in the last 12 months. So you can't hang your hat on 4.2% drop in Sydney and think that the whole place has fallen by that amount, because largely it's the big end of town that's come down, whereas the middle road has actually performed quite well and have actually had some growth in the last 12 months. So that's interesting. So the blue is the last quarter and the black is the last 12 months. So interesting. Sydney. Last quarter for Sydney was a 0.9 drop, and the 12 months, as we've said, is 4.2% lower. And it's 4.5% lower than the peak, and the peak was in July 2017. So we've come back 4.5% from the peak. Melbourne. So Melbourne was 2.2 higher, but what jumps out at me with these stats is that the last quarter Melbourne's actually come back. So Melbourne's come back by 1.2% in the last quarter. So obviously it's trending down now. So an article came out today that ANZ have readjusted their housing figures to say that Melbourne and Sydney readjusted what they think is going to be the drop in Melbourne and Sydney, and they're saying 10% now. So based on the figures, they're saying, you know, Sydney's gone 4.5% from peak to trough, and Melbourne's got a long way to go. That's obviously banks being conservative. Banks, you know, are they trying to scare the valuers? Are they trying to push opinions? Who knows? But that's what happened today, is that was an adjustment that ANZ made.
Why do they do that? For what benefit?
I think it's just their forecasting. They've got a housing forecast, and they readjusted their housing forecast. The economists for ANZ did that today. Yeah. Brisbane, whole lot of nothing in Brisbane. So 0.2% growth in the last quarter, 0.9 in the last 12 months. But what is interesting in this slide is that houses went up by 1.2% while rents came back slightly. So on units, units came back slightly while houses went 1.2%. So land has moved in Brisbane slightly, whereas potentially the oversupply coming and the unit market demand has seen a fall in the unit prices in Brisbane. Rental growth. We're not seeing a whole lot of rental growth in the capitals. Combined capitals is the black line, whereas the combined regionals is the blue line. So regional cities rent growth, so rent growth is remaining around about that 3% mark, whereas in the combined capitals, it's actually coming down, getting towards zero growth on your rentals. Sydney in particular is 0.5% growth in the last 12 months, while Hobart has seen 11.2%. So I've just got a property empty in Minto, and I would be happy to take the same rent that I had the last tenant paying. So whereas I'm sure Paul would tell you, if I had a Hobart property with a 12-month lease coming up and I had 300 on it, I wouldn't be happy with 300 again. I'd be looking to try and get your 330 out of the next lease. So it's important to know your numbers and know where your properties are and whether to push for a rent increase or take what you can get when you can get it. So interesting numbers. Perth is quite stable there as well. So that was an interesting one in terms of rental amounts aren't dropping a whole lot in Perth over the last 12 months as well. Interest rates. So interest rates have been on hold for a long time now, and rates that we're seeing for owner-occupied loans are as cheap as they've ever been. And over the last 18 months, I guess we've spoken so much about the investment market and the differential at times over the last 18 months has been 1% difference between your owner-occupied rate to your investment rate. What we're seeing now, and I don't know whether it's the APRA 10% hurdle has been removed from the banks, which it has, but we're now seeing rates on investment loans much closer to your owner-occupied loans. So doing a review for a client this afternoon, he had a reasonable St George loan 3 years ago, 5.37 interest-only investment, which is where we see a lot of people sort of sitting with their investment interest-only loans. We're in a position now where the bank came straight back at 4.97 when we pushed them, so 0.4 of a drop within 5 minutes. But to push harder is what we're going to do, because interest only, he can get 4.29 interest only on his investment, and if he's willing to take principal and interest, he can actually get 3.89 on a principal and interest repayment on an investment loan. And owner-occupied rates are at 3.59, 3.69 as the cheapest. So the differential really is only sort of 20 basis points now, whereas previously we've been talking about a gap of 100 points, 1%. So interest rates are cheap, and I guess the message is that your investment rates should be reviewed. If you haven't reviewed them, review them. Your owner-occupied rate you should be paying as cheap as you've ever paid, because they are as cheap as you've ever seen. As I mentioned, we're looking at CoreLogic here. We use CoreLogic a lot. We also do a lot of property reports, so evals, which is electronic valuations, which are short form valuations, comparative market reports. I'm sure all these guys use them as well. They're the tools that we sort of use to get a quick guide on property values. There's also suburb reports, sales reports on the area in terms of what's on the market. There's a whole lot of information that we can get when we're researching property from CoreLogic. So I know that when Diana was handing out the forms, she mentioned that just put down an address that you'd like a comparative market report on. We're happy to do those. We pay the subscription to get them, so we're happy to do them and hand them out. So please feel free to put in a property address on the forms tonight and an email address, and we'll get those reports out to you, because it's all about researching like a pro tonight. So that's one of the tools that we use that we're happy to share. But some of the free tools, I know Jeremy's going to touch on realestate.com. Realestate.com has some free tools that you can use. It's not just searching for property, Jeremy.
Yeah, so I stumbled across this probably around about 4 years ago when realestate.com introduced it, and I didn't have paid subscriptions to Pricefinder or RP Data at that time. It was just too expensive and it wasn't really feasible for me to do it. So when I just stumbled across realestate.com a little bit, I saw this new tab called Invest. And what that Invest tab allows you to do is just jump on things and compare how things are. So you'll see this tab shows you where the different suburbs are when you put a localised suburb in, how they're performing against other suburbs, what are the top forecasted growth suburbs in, say, Sydney or New South Wales or Melbourne, where's the cash flow hotspots. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that it comes up with, I've done Minto, for instance, picked the property in Minto, and it comes up with the annual growth, what the median house price is, what the median rent is, $420 per week, and it shows you what the historic median rent was. And believe it or not, the median rent back in 2012 was $420, 2015 went up to about $450, and then say 2018 it has come back down to about $420. It shows what your average rental yield is, about 3.5%, and it even goes as far to show you what an expected cash flow per month deficit it would be on a genuine P&I loan at say 3.8%, and taking into account what your tax would be as well. So that's just a really, really good quick 2 minutes to spend if you ever get a chance to go on realestate.com, plug in your suburb and find out, I suppose, the characteristics and statistics of how your suburb is performing against other suburbs, and how's your yield, how's your rent, how's your median house price going as well. If we go to the next one, this is just purely another suburb I've chosen, and it's more so to do with, I've picked 4-bed houses in Leppington, and it comes up with all that yellow area is sub 1.5%, what they call net yields. So just, you can change it, you can chop it, you can add different fields in it, and it just spits out a lot of data which may be useful, may not be useful, but nevertheless sometimes a little bit more data, more knowledge is a good thing. That's my quick 2 minutes on that Invest tab on realestate.com.
I'll just ask Ross to run us through some research tools. When you're talking research tools, there's some free ones, and there's also some paid subscriptions that you can look at. So Ross, do you want to take us through those?
Yeah, so it's great whether you're using a buyer's agent, whether you're researching yourself. It's good to know the tools that you can go to double check, do some of your own sort of due diligence. So Jerry mentioned realestate.com. onthehouse.com.au has some basic free reports that'll show you when that property last sold, estimated values and things like that. SQM Research, that's one that shows a lot of vacancy rates and is a good tool to do that, as well as some basic property reports and things like that. Domain.com.au, again, they have the home price guide that probably a lot of you have seen. You need to go look a bit further in that website, into the more, and you'll find the property reports on domain.com.au. htw.com.au does a fantastic report every month. It's called the Month in Review, and it does both commercial real estate and residential, and it'll give you an overview from a valuer's perspective, so it's quite detailed, and it'll go through a report in all the different areas from their valuers. So you can subscribe to that Month in Review, and it comes into your email. So it's Hare and Todd White is the name of the valuer firm, and which is one of the largest valuers in the country, and they will provide that report. Homesales.com.au, I think this is owned by BMT Tax Depreciation now. So that has some good, if you're looking for like depreciation reports, you're looking at how much depreciation you could potentially get on a property that you're looking at buying, as well as some other types things. They're sort of in competition with someone like realestate.com or Domain, but that feature on it I really like, is the depreciation part. Looking at stats, the ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics website, looking at different demographics. The things that I like is like you can see the percentage of properties that are people with mortgages, percentage of renters, first owner occupiers, as well as listening to some of the podcasts. There's some really good, and people share their stories of where they're buying and the success stories that they've had, so chuck it on in the car. So the two that I like are the Smart Property Investment and the Property Couch, but there's other ones out there. Have you got any others that you guys like? No, but they're the two main ones. And then there's some property forums. Property Chat is the main one. I know Jeremy uses that one a bit, don't you, Jeremy? If you're being trolled, it might be from Jeremy. But again, a good way to sort of ask some questions and find some good information. So before we did get the experts out, I thought we'd just run through any questions on any of those. Okay, great. Looking at some of the paid tools now, CoreLogic is sometimes known as RP Data Professional. They're the same things as, say, most, I know Munzerl, myself, probably most of the buyer's agent subscribe to these different tools. So if you need some reports, we can provide. Real Estate Investor is another one. There's Price Finder, there's Residex reports, there's Hot Spotting reports, there's Australian Property Monitors reports. There's not so many property magazines around. A few have gone by the wayside recently. I think Your Investment Property, but Smart Property Investment website is a very good. They used to have a magazine, but it's gone mostly online now. So there's some good paid ones as well. I'll bring Munzerl from Keshab up. Welcome, Munzerl. And I'll introduce the panel. So first up, we've got Paul Glossop. He's principal of... take a seat, bud. So he's a passionate property investor, multi-award winner in his buyer's agency, and he's on a board member of PIPA. You want to tell us a little bit more about your business?
I think most of us here probably heard the spiel a couple of times, but we effectively are an agency who are focused on probably more so aligning what we do as a business to people's individual goals, objectives, as opposed to probably buying in a particular market. If you ask me right now, where am I buying? It'll be probably across 4 or 5, maybe 6 different markets and different property types for different reasons. So a lot of what we do is really trying to make sure it's a truly tailored approach to understanding position versus property type and effectively what the outcome we're trying to achieve, but not just the property, but in conjunction with making sure finance and strategy on the finance as well as accountancy finance is aligned. So that's really what we do as a holistic business.
Beautiful. Luke, if I may invite you on the stage as well. So Luke is being the principal of First Time Property Investing, and you've been investing for many years, and you've recently started the buyer's agency. So perhaps if you tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I've been working with clients, and I guess a single focus on first-time property investing is really to work on that mindset, because I think a lot of people when they're first starting out struggle with that big thing of taking action. So that's been first and foremost, and just recently started a new business, buyer's agency, with the experience that we've had, myself and Mark up in Brisbane. We've been able to hit the ground running with that, and it's called Search Party Property.
Excellent. Next person I'd like to welcome is Christine. Christine Rutledge is the Director of Buy Right Buyers Agency. She, again, is a property investor herself, and her passion for property led her away from law and into being a buyer's agent. So you want to tell us a little bit about your business, Christine?
Yep, so I've been a buyer's agent for about 8 years now. I actually met Ross when our sons were both doing swimming lessons many years ago. So I'm a bit of a mix like these guys. I like to educate my clients. So a lot of my clients are first-time investors, so being able to educate them along the process to be able to make the right decision. I meet with them and, again, like Paul said, cater their property choices to their objectives and their goals.
Beautiful. And Jay Anderson, if I may introduce yourself to the group as well. Jay is, I know Jay over many years, and I always found Jay, in terms of your sort of research and your attention to detail and your Excel, and very detailed Excel, fantastic. So Jay is being a property investor over many years, and parents being property investors as well over many years. I know you helped out a number of people along the way, and recently starting your buyer's agency as well.
Yeah, so Jay Anderson Property. Big focus of mine's around property strategy. So we sit down with clients and we work out what their goals are and making investment decisions now, thinking about how might that affect property decisions down the track. So making the right purchase now to align us to making correct investment decisions, property 2, property 3, property 4, and so on. But we're very heavily focused on research and data on all of our investment.
Yeah, so I suppose, Jay, is that looking through some of those tools, and I was going through all those tools that Rossi sort of showed, right? So there are so many tools in the open world now, right? There's information, and is it information overload, I suppose? So if I'm a sort of a mum and dad investor, I'm investing for the first property, I'm investing for the second and the third. How do I research? How do I research as a pro?
Price Finder I use quite heavily. That is quite expensive. It's about $350 a month for the pro subscription. But in terms of the free tools, the realestate.com, what Jeremy touched on before, it's a great starting point. SQM. And then there's some other tools, some free tools which probably aren't common knowledge or might be overlooked sometimes. One of those that I really like is a website called WalkScore. So it's walkscore.com. Type in a property's address, and the website uses an algorithm to give the property a rating, a walk score out of 100. And so while that score isn't the be-all and end-all, there is a strong correlation between a property's walk score and its investment performance. So what I mean by that is, if we had two very similar properties in the same suburb, so say we've got property A and property B, and property A has a higher walk score, well, research shows that that property will have less days on market, both for sale and for rent. It'll also achieve a higher weekly rental. And number 3, in a rising market, a property with a higher walk score will see greater percentage gains in a rising market. And that's a free tool.
Beautiful, beautiful. I suppose, Christine, from your point of view, in terms of your sort of the 8 years or so with the buyer's agency, what are some of the traditional tools that you utilise from your point of view?
In addition to all the online information and statistics, I think a huge part of it is relationships and building relationships. That's a major part. So you've got to combine all the statistics, etc., with on-the-ground basically being on the ground, building up relationships with real estate agents, property managers, other local investment advisors up in the areas or in the areas that you're looking at, and that combination of the statistics as well as that local knowledge. So that's a major part of what I use when I'm making decisions on properties in areas is those relationships with local agents and other people.
Yeah, and some of the standard sort of things which I sort of say, when people sort of say, Montreal, I found a particular property, how do I know whether it's the right market value? Because there's just so much information. So even at a basic, if you go to the realestate.com and if you just type in a particular sort of a suburb, you get a sort of a high level understanding where the market is and what are the prices. And if you go to the sold sections, then one can, I suppose, see all the properties which are being recently sold and what are the prices with the recently sold. Look, from your point of view, and how do you do the research, if I may?
I guess another one that wasn't probably brought up there is going to the council websites. So have a look at the local council. I think Christine and Jay both hit on some really good points as well. But being, an area expert for the area that you're going in. So don't pick too many areas or too many suburbs. Just be an absolute master of one or two areas and pick those with all the research you've done through the data, statistics and looking at local council. But after you get to that point, just really hit the ground running and develop those relationships like Christine said. And it's, I think half of it really is probably the property knowledge and the data and everything, and then half of it's in the negotiations. So actually getting deals across the line and finding out what properties in the suburb have less competition when you're going into that negotiation as opposed to others, and why there might be off-market deals if you've developed those relationships with maybe some of the agents.
So, I mean, there's lots of data, Paul, and in terms of, obviously the number of properties, we've talked about yields, we've talked about vacancy rates. What are some of the things within the data that you're looking for? Because, people can see the numbers, but the numbers might not mean anything to them. So are you looking for changes? What are you actually looking for in the numbers?
Yeah, it's a good point because to be honest with you could probably take all 24 of the different subscriptions, paid and non-paid, that we've just gone through there, and probably out of that, probably look at data for literally years and probably realise that there is just a lot of data ultimately. Then it's how do you disseminate what actually means anything and what's going to affect change, because that's really all we're trying to figure out is data, what is actually going to create change. Maybe not change now, but change in a period of time. And it's potentially not necessarily, the problem with data too is it's always historical. So you're never looking at future data necessarily. You will look at what's happened and you will look at it within the last 6 months, the last year, the last 2 years, so on and so forth. And you can go right back to really literally 1900s and figure out what's happened since then to now and try to drag out all that data. But for us, it's trying to find a combination or a correlation between certain data points which are working in our favour, in addition to what we can see from announcements and or commitments from both population growth, be it also things such as infrastructure spends, commitments to certain jobs creators, supply v demand that's happening now, but also how that's going to correlate to probably more of a crescendo of saying we can see where it is, we can see where it's going, we know where we are in 5 years, and from a commitment perspective, that therefore gives us much more confidence, because ultimately if this was going to end up here, then we'd say, look, it's guaranteed by here. But ultimately it's the combination of where we see data, where it's actually pointing to much more of it in our favour. Things like we've just had more or less half a dozen state budgets handed down over the last week, and what we do as an office right now is just look through what does this mean for every single one of these markets, both on the macro across the state, how does that funnel down to every single particular market. I mean, we look at right now, New South Wales was handed down. Last 24 hours, we've got a lot of work to do to figure out what does this actually mean. We've got a change in the New South Wales planning scheme that's going to go live as of next month. What does this mean for anyone who owns a home or an investment in New South Wales? And effectively, we've seen that the data suggesting we might be on a slide at the moment. In the next 12 months, 24 months are going to show that we'll probably see markets quite spotty. But there's still going to be opportunities right across this state, for example. That's, I think, because we see data suggesting that we're seeing a declining market, then everyone's going to overlook Sydney, Greater Sydney areas, New South Wales as a general, but there will be opportunities similar to will be in Victoria as well. So I think it's more so also looking at what's happening as opposed to just what data points are showing to the from our side of things where they're starting to probably work in our favour.
And then I suppose, Paul, it's sort of, I agree with all of those comments. I suppose at the same time it sort of comes back to your sort of the individual goals and objectives where you sort of started, right? So one common thing which I use quite a bit is that in the realestate.com as an example, I utilize quite a bit about the keywords. So let's say as an example that I'm looking for a property which has got granny flat potential, and when you do a bit of a search, and if you just put the keyword the granny flat, then it sort of brings in all those property in a particular area in terms of some level of sort of granny flat potential, right? So, so Jay, if I might go back and in terms of, I suppose, where are the markets? So we understand some of the tools and some of the information that we have. So from your point of view, you and your clients, what are the markets that you're sort of looking at the moment, and what are the markets you're targeting and why?
Yep, Southeast Queensland, so we're really strong in the Moreton Bay region. I think there's a lot happening there in terms of population growth, infrastructure, and job creation. Again, Paul was saying about the budgets that had just been handed down. The Queensland budget, I think, had $45 billion worth of infrastructure spending that's going to occur over the next 4 years, which is just going to support that growing region even more. Getting down into the actual data side of the population growth in Moreton Bay, a lot of it is net interstate migration. A lot of that's made up of millennials moving from New South Wales and Victoria, moving up there. They've got double household income. A lot of them are university educated, so they're moving into an area with a higher level of education, higher income, and they're moving there for affordability. So that's going to really stimulate that area in terms of gentrification.
And see, I'm personally quite a bit of big fan of that sort of area, and Paul sort of assisted me in terms of purchasing a couple of properties in those areas as well. So Paul, I look into, well, we sort of that sort of region, right? So you've got a whole lot of different area. You've got Redcliffe, you've got Kippering and Kalunga and sort of, you know, Deception Bay and so forth. Any favourite from your point of view?
You're asking me the key questions.
Which house?
We've got I'll give you an example. So right now we probably will have a contract to a client for a probably 2-acre block of land in Kalunga tomorrow, which looks like it's going to probably yield about 40 townhouses in a market that's about 400 metres from the university site. And when you jumps onto Google Earth, you could probably run through any kind of property and you'll probably figure out which one it is. It's not on market, so good luck. But in saying that, to be honest with you, from our side of things, it probably comes down to what the intention is, because if you look at it from a yield perspective, everywhere from probably as low as Strathpine right up to probably Caboolture South over towards Burpengary, down towards Deception Bay and the whole peninsula, it's a market that will probably have a lot more of that investor stock as well as owner-occupier specific. The peninsula itself has a very good lifestyle orientation, however, it's probably a little bit lacking in amenity as far as being able to get you to the CBD to a degree. However, if you've got people who are happy to travel 35, 45 minutes via 2 different roads and a rail network to the CBD, they're going to be happy to choose that as a lifestyle. I think from a renter perspective, if you look at that future potential, we're probably looking at markets around the Petrie old paper mill university site, which is obviously going to be yielding a lot more people, a lot more jobs, and ideally over time a lot more demand. But also that doesn't necessarily mean that anything within a four iron of the Petrie University site is going to be going up in value, because then it comes down to what's the supply issue looking like there, as well as what are other markets that are potentially going to be corralled by things like state parks, things like certain roads, facilities, and you'll have a look pretty quickly in there that there's actually a few different wedges that are probably going to be already fully built out. And those areas are the ones which we probably would prefer to say if they can't build further or if you can't release new land, ideally there's going to be rezoning. Those rezoned pockets over time will do better. However, in the short term, you're probably getting a softer yield. So it comes down to probably more the rationale. But we're definitely fans of that market in general. It probably comes down to, is it a yield play? How long do you have for it to work? And how much do you have to spend?
And I must say, from my point of view, one of the market which sort of surprised me quite a bit is Hobart, right? I remember that you were one of the early sort of the supporter of Hobart, and I remember I look back and I said, well, do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the population growth? Do we have this? Do we have this? Is it Hobart is simply because we don't have any other alternate as such? And we've seen some of the statistics. So I suppose the question comes in our mind, in my mind, that is it too late, or what is really driving Hobart?
Yeah, really good question. I think there's a couple of our clients in the audience today who we've been buying in Hobart for close to 2.5 years now. We're probably dialing back buying there at the moment. We still are in drips and drabs, definitely not at the volume we were probably 12, 24 months ago. At the time when we probably were first investing in Hobart, the numbers were, and it's kind of similar to where we see Brisbane at the moment, where they looked good, however things hadn't necessarily happened. And they were things such as, I'll probably outline a couple of the key things that we saw in Hobart at the time, one of which was most certainly vacancy rates. At the time we were investing there, they were sub 1%. And it wasn't just sub 1% when you looked at it and think, well, is it just certain pockets which are sub 1%? Holistically, Hobart Greater Region was sub 1%. And we dug a bit deeper to figure out how many properties are actually available for rent. And it was about 23, 24%. When you look at that, you think, geez, there's not many properties here that are actually on the rental market. So how can this change when the actual government is not pro-development? So what you had was also an issue that the government wasn't incentivising people to build. So you didn't necessarily have developers, investors thinking, well, I can get good yield for my money. Yeah, the market hasn't necessarily started to grow exponentially, but there's no incentive, there's no first homeowner grants at the time. There wasn't any going to be things like affordable housing schemes, etc. In the last 12 months, we've seen some changes. State government was handed down about 4 days ago there. However, in that time, we've still seen a heightened level of jobs growth. So jobs creation was a big one. They saw about 9.5%, 10% jobs creation in the past 12 months. In addition to that, as much as it's quite small, percentage-wise across the country, they saw a much larger percentage of people staying in Hobart. The biggest issue Hobart's had over the years is when there's no jobs, people flee to Melbourne, they flee to Sydney, and they don't go back. And that leaves a whole of skilled labour, higher earners, as well as population growth putting pressure on housing, whereas the last couple of years with that jobs creation, they've retained all the university graduates, as well as incentivised with federal government to a degree, baby boomers now having the opportunity to sell their family asset, take $300,000 out of their family asset for both owners of that property up to that amount, put it into their super, and then buy outside of that. We've seen also there's been a bit more of that baby boomer buying into that market to get an affordable housing, as well as put a whole bunch of more money from their family home into their super and have a much better lifestyle from it, which was probably a bit of a side expectation for us. But they're things that have put a lot more pressure on that 10 to 15 kilometre radius area of Hobart over time. We're probably going to buy there, I think, realistically for another maybe 6, 12 months, maybe. But we're extremely selective now because what we were buying, literally the first house I bought for a client in Hobart was an auction mortgagee. I was the only person there. It was me, an auctioneer, and it was also the real estate agent, and it was like this in front of a house. There was no one there. It was a trustee, so they had to forcibly sell the house at auction. Called it 3 times, no bid, obviously, and then after there was a negotiation, and that property is probably worth about 70, 75% more today than what we paid for it, and it's yielding about 9%. And they're the properties that, you know, truth be told, if I knew it was going to happen, I would have bought that house. I would have bought every other house over the last 2 years that we bought there. But, I mean, there are opportunities. I think the question is there other markets that show that opportunity for the next... And
I think that's a good question. What other markets are you looking at, Christine, at the moment?
I'm like Jay. My clients I concentrate on are between the sort of 300,000 and 400,000. So that's concentrating in the southeast region. When you look at the statistics that we're talking about with the ABS and the council websites, which are absolutely fantastic up there, they look at population growth forecasts, which are really important, supply and demand. You've got Ipswich, which is currently around the 200,000 mark, but it's forecast to grow to 450,000 by the year 2031. Logan's forecast to grow, same as the Moreton Bay areas, but not quite as high. You're looking at the money of the government, so when you're looking at the budget, the amount of infrastructure that's gone on over the last 5 years or so, all the major freeways, so the M2 freeway that goes out to Ipswich, you've got the new train line that's going to be extended from Springfield all the way around to the south and then back up to the university. You've got Costco going in there, so in Bundamba, you know, they do a lot of research before they build big businesses like that. Same with up in the Moreton Bay, they've got the Costco in there, IKEA in there, and the amount of infrastructure. They've had the Kippering extension, which I think it opened a couple of years ago. But when you're looking at...
That was the train line?
The train line, sorry, yep. So all those sorts of things, you never look at anything in isolation. I was actually going to give an example of when you look at, I think it was on the cover of API magazine a few years ago, And if people chose property purely on one sort of statistic, such as this area's got the highest population growth, that's a huge mistake. And they featured this young gun, and it was a girl who'd bought, she had $2-3 million worth of property, whatever it was, and she was earning a massive rental yield. But she'd bought mostly in mining towns, so she'd bought up in Port Hedland, Gladstone and a few other places. I think it was 2 years later, or within 2 years later, when the resource boom had, cut back a fair bit, all of a sudden she couldn't sell the properties, the rents had dropped dramatically. So when it comes to looking at statistics, you can't look at any of them in isolation. I know other investors who, I think New South Wales, one of the highest growing areas, it was Salamander Bay up at Port Stephens. And if you looked at that, you went, oh wow, I'm going to invest in there. But if you had the local knowledge, you knew that most of that median house price had increased purely because of the sales in one resort. And these were sort of, what are they called? The holiday lettings. So the median price was massive. Then all of a sudden the banks revalued them and actually called back the gap in them, and all of a sudden then the market dropped back dramatically. So it went from one of the fastest growing regions in the state to all of a sudden, complete opposite. So that's a really important thing when you're looking at statistics, is to look at them as a whole. So the council websites are really great, so it shows the population, construction that's happening, and then the infrastructure that's going into the area, and also other projects that are going in. So that's really vital that you've got that local knowledge as well as the statistics that come out.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and you touch on the fundamentals, and for your investors, Luke, buying their first property, obviously you've got to get your first property right, because makes the cornerstone for your properties moving forward. So what are, for your first time, your first time investors, what are some of the basic fundamentals that you talk to them about and that you try to look for them?
Well, I guess first and foremost is really getting in and taking action. And like Ross says about, you want to make that first one great, but at the same time, you still want to take that action. And maybe sometimes, even if you learn from your mistakes, it might not be that bad. But, I guess our role, all of us, is to minimise those mistakes. I remember buying my first property on my own, and I made mistakes buying out in Western Sydney at the peak of the market. And I learned from that experience hugely. And I'm here today because of that story as well. And I think the big thing about it, I guess we're in a market right now where affordability is, and like these guys, Southeast Queensland is a big one for me because of that affordability. And the factor that when you're looking at investing, probably one of the first things that I'll look at is minimising your risk. What market in Australia can you minimise your risk? When we talk about population growth, when we talk about the infrastructure spending and so forth, and when we talk about rents that are being paid by your tenants, is it a situation if you're buying in close to a capital city, if those people can't afford, well, where do they go? They move further out into the suburbs. So if you're in a situation where you're 15 or 35 Ks out of the CBD, for example, in Brisbane, then if people need to move out further, they're going to come into those affordable suburbs if there is a recession or if there's a GFC come. And, even if to the extent the Australian government still pays Centrelink payments, well, your renters are still going to be there making payments, aren't they? So I think having those affordable areas makes, helps first-time investors really minimise their risk.
Yeah, look, one of the comments which was coming through in my mind is that, Jay, you raised about Queensland, and Christine, you raised about Queensland. I spoke about Queensland. You spoke about Queensland as well. We all seem to be a big fan of Queensland, right? Then we sort of look through the statistics and we're saying that whether Brisbane really has done much so far. How important, I suppose, is diversification, Paul? And so if I'm an investor, which I already have a whole bunch of properties in Brisbane for that matter, what are the other markets that I should be looking from a diversification point of view, and how important it is?
Yeah, look, I think diversification is a pretty sexy word when it comes down to property, for the fact that sometimes I think people confuse it with boredom. And I think to a degree, there's only ever going to be a small amount of markets which are actually going to perform in a finite period of time. Australia doesn't move in a linear line. We move in different market cycles, and it's going to be based on a whole bunch of different trends that we've already discussed. Factoring in diversification, I think there's a few things that we always consider with our clients who probably end up with multiple properties in a portfolio. For us, it comes down to what have they bought at what time in that market in particular. So things such as state-based land tax, it's a state tax in this country, and obviously understanding how that affects overall investment strategies, cash flows, etc. I think that's where a good accountant gives advice before purchases are made, as well as what the strategy is for the next purchase, understanding what your thresholds are, personal names versus trusts versus superannuations, etc. Also from us, it also looks like making sure that when you've got a certain amount of exposure, that effectively that exposure isn't there because you're trying to jump on the back of potentially bandwagon buying, and that can be sometimes when we look at potentially people who have bought in Sydney as an example, or Melbourne as an example, probably over the last 18, 24 months, where it's probably bought too close towards the back end of the boom to really see true growth in this cycle. And they've probably now, truth be told, got 7 to 15 years if they've bought buy and hold strategy properties for that property to really mature and do its work. So diversification in that sense, if that's your only play and you're really sitting there, fingers crossed that that's going to work, then you really need to look at saying, if you're waiting there, expecting what happened in the last 5 years to happen in the next 5 years, you're probably going to wait twice, if not 3 times as long. So diversification for us allows our clients to get exposure into markets, to get different growth cycles accessed, as well as getting opportunity to also get opportunity for cash flow if need be, whether it's a cash flow play, capital growth play, development play. But on top of that, I think, and this is something you speak a lot about, Munzrel, and over the years I've known you speak about this part too, and I've learnt this from a lot of investors that I work with, that the best investors I know understand that property in isolation is quite risky. If you've got one property, you've got 100% exposure in one property. If you've got 2 properties, you've got 50% exposure in 2 properties, so on and so forth, where it doesn't mean that 50 properties is really what the target is. However, there is some safety or comfort in numbers, whereas if you've got 5 properties, 1 is vacant, you've got 20% vacancy rate. If you've got 10, you've got 10% vacancy rate. So there is also some backstops you have in play, as long as those properties have been purchased with the right rationale in mind. So I think it also allows you to be comfortable being uncomfortable. So debt becomes really good debt when it's exposed to multiple assets as well, because it's not all the eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the points which I sort of take away quite a bit in terms of the diversification and the debts and sort of the maturity is also the cycle as well. So it's not the diversification for the sake of the diversification as such. Diversification naturally flows through over a period of time if you invest in the right cycle. So if I look back into myself, and I'll sort of say that in my early investment, all I invested was in New South Wales because the market made sense at that stage. Then there was a point of time that I didn't invest in New South Wales for a good period of time, and Queensland seems to be some of the fundamentals sort of make sense.
Yeah, and I'm the same in my portfolio. I started in New South Wales back in, and then bought a number for 4 or 5 in there, and then went to Queensland, bit in Melbourne, bit in Adelaide, and so but I agree, it's at a point in time that a market will get, so it might not be diversification for the sake of it, it might be in that market, but when the market has run its course, then you look at the next market. So I guess on that, what and maybe Jay, what markets are you researching next? Like what and what are some of the signs that you're looking for that, when that happens, I might go to that market?
Adelaide is one. There's some pockets in Adelaide which I'm strong on, especially down the south towards kind of Christie's Beach, Port Noarlunga area. Yeah. There's a lot happening there. I've just started looking deeply into Perth. I think there's some early signs of recovery in Perth. I'm not buying there yet. I'm not going to jump in there yet, but I think some of the data is starting to...
And what data, I mean, this is all about research. What data are you looking for that'll go, okay, this is the time to go into a market like Perth?
So the 3 core fundamentals that I always look at: population growth, infrastructure, and employment, so job creation. In that population growth, though, on a local government area, I want to look up what's the makeup of that population growth. And the reason I say that is any retirement zones or holiday areas, I cross off, not interested in. So I want to make sure that the population growth are people that are going to be moving there, living there, they're going to be getting jobs, they're going to be, building families, stuff like that. Infrastructure, I want to see where the government's spending all their money, the new rail lines, the hospitals, universities, and also the local government infrastructure spending as well. Looking at their master plan, what are they doing, how are they going? And then job creation as well. We want long sustainable job creation, not individual projects. So I'll use like the Commonwealth Games, for example, that did get a big influx of job creation. But once the Commonwealth Games, once all the stadiums and everything was built, then that supply of jobs was cut off.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because, you know, we spoke about mining towns and things like the Commonwealth Games. So you got to understand what's happening when these places and these mining towns are going through the boom. You know, there's a lot of construction, it brings a lot of workers in, they need somewhere to live, and then it goes to, you know, just everyday running. And then all those people move out, and then you suddenly, the high rents that you were getting come back, and it's just day-to-day functioning. And similar, you know, with something like the Commonwealth Games, it's big hype, there's a lot of construction, there's a lot of things going. But once those people move out, then it's business as usual and the market comes back to a level. So, you know, that and looking at the number of industries that are serving that. So if you've only got one industry serving like a mine, how many industries are you looking for, Christine? What's a good number to look at?
Multiple. I mean, I remember I had a client who rang me and said, I found this property. It's only $60,000. Excellent return, rental return, etc. And I can't even remember the name of the town now, but I looked it up and I went, oh my God, it's got one industry. So if something happens to that industry, all of a sudden, bang, there goes that town. So depends on what area. So if it's not a major city, so you're Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, and it's almost like a sub-city, I look at the size of the population. I look at things like the average time on market, which shows you that the turnover, if for some reason you need to sell a property, is it in a market that's going to turn over? So I'm looking at also proximity to the city, so it may not necessarily be in the capital city, but half an hour outside. So at the Ipswich councils, half an hour outside, Logan, Moreton Bay, etc. So whilst they've still got the local industry, they've still got the access to the city by whatever means of transport, for workers to go in there. Same with in New South Wales, so everything from Central Coast, Newcastle, Wollongong, whilst they've got great local industry, they've also got that proximity back to the city. So you really need to be in an area that's self-supporting kind of area. So regional towns years ago, I had clients that didn't have much, but we ended up buying in major country towns like Tamworth, Dubbo, that have got university campuses, they've got hospitals, so they've got the fly-in, fly-out hospitals as well that service the major regional towns, plus they've got a population of at least sort of 50,000 people, so, and they've got a lot of local industry. So when you're looking at areas, yeah, definitely you steer clear of anything that's relying on one or two industries.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. So a whole lot of macro, right? Whole lot of a macro sort of economics sort of that we sort of consider. So look, let's say that I've gone through all of the sort of macro and I've sort of identified a particular area, right? This is the area that I do want to buy. It falls in within my own goals. It falls in within my budget and so forth, right? And I found a particular property. What are the research that I would do as an investor on that one particular property, and whether it falls in within my investment guide? What are some of the basic tips, I suppose?
I guess what you want to look at is in, you know, what's happening with past sales, what's happening with the vacancy rates. We've talked about, you know, some of that basic data around that particular area. I spoke about the council and seeing what they're doing in terms of infrastructure in the area. I wanted to sort of highlight, you know, on the macro side of things, just for a second, what we've got to also realise when we talk about things like the Commonwealth Games, as an example, see what like the media are talking about, and you know, the consumer confidence that is happening on the back of that. And obviously, the run up to the Commonwealth Games, there was huge media attention up there, and a lot of people were buying, and then all of a sudden that sort of pulls back afterwards when all that, you know, all that excitement went away. Back to the particular house, you know, you really want to get out in the ground and do the local research. Looking at that particular house, you know, talk to the neighbours, see what they're saying, see what the local agents are saying, and not only one local agent. So the agent that's selling that property is obviously going to sell it to get that sale. but challenge another agent on that particular property to say, oh, what do you think about that property? Should I be buying something like that? Or is there anything you know about that property? Neighbours are a good one if you can hang around before and after. And then actually, what I talked about before about negotiations, seeing what your competition's like. So turn up before the inspection and talk to the agent. Stay back after the inspection. Count how many people are actually attending the inspection. And, see if there's people taking contracts, and then questioning the agent about how much people are taking contracts or putting in offers. And you want to try and ask those potent questions of the agents that might drill out the reasons why someone's selling. So that's where you can maybe have some negotiation side for you to go forward and make a good offer forward for that particular house.
Yeah, no, brilliant. I suppose some of the other things, that I sort of personally look through. I mean, we all do building report and the pest report and the strata report, right? So structurally, whether it's okay. Yeah. Some of the other things on top of my head, I suppose, is that the easement, whether there is an easement of a particular property. Is it next to a housing commission? Do we have a flood? I mean, you speak about Logan and some of the areas, and I do have a number of properties in Logan and Ipswich, and some of the areas are better area, and some of the areas are a little bit a flood-oriented area. So
it's interesting that you're more analytical than I'm about negotiations.
I like it.
Yeah. But I mean, you touched on neighbours, and I've got a place in Cranebrook that's got a housing commission next door, and that neighbours, it's the one property they park them in. It's a battle axe block, and they've caused me no amount of grief. So I think neighbours is definitely something to research on the individual property.
Yeah, and I suppose at the same time, depending on what the objective is, right? So why am I buying that property? So we hear, Paul, quite a bit in terms of the natural growth and the manufactured growth and the subdivision potential, granny flat. We hear that all the time, right? All this granny flat a flavour. So what are some of the research from your point of view? I suppose it depends on a council basis, but at a high level, some of the research in terms of development potential.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, I think, from our side, is that I think firstly, the market in general, be it the local government area and then the suburb itself, is probably going to do 60, 70, 80% of the growth in that market, and your particular property is going to do the rest. And then obviously understanding what your objective is for that property is really the main key, and then doing the research to understand if you're buying it for a purpose, can that purpose be fulfilled by doing that research before you actually exchange contracts. So from our side of things, our team, and being really try to be specialists in not just the negotiation but also the refinement of the detail before we get to the point of even bothering putting an offer in on the property, is, for instance, if we're looking at a property that we might want to look at let's say a granny flat, for example. Granny flats in New South Wales and in Sydney in particular get a massive bit of airtime because we are very pro granny flats. However, you go outside of Sydney, you go outside of New South Wales, and people don't talk about granny flats the same way we talk about granny flats. And it's for a few reasons. Firstly, the demand in Sydney is extremely high, or has been extremely high. We've had a huge deficit in supply. So therefore, affordable accommodation, auxiliary dwellings have been quite a useful way for New South Wales and state governments to be able to fulfil that kind of demand there. So it's cheap, it's effective, it's quick. But in other markets, they don't have the same deficit in demand. So we need to understand, well, what is their regulations on granny flats? Queensland's very different to New South Wales. Victoria is more or less impossible. Hobart, Tasmania has different rules, regulations. South Australia, so on and so forth. So I think understanding really what market you're buying in and why you're buying that property. For granny flats as a great example, if you are thinking about it, and I'll give Moreton Bay as an example, because when you look at somewhere that's got potentially Petra University, 10,000 students proposed to be there within the next 4 years, you look at it straight away and you assume, well, 10,000 students, great. That means that there's probably going to be an additional influx of desire or need for smaller accommodation for students, be it 1-2 bedroom accommodation. So I think things like townhouses units will probably get a little bit of increased demand. There is a bit of supply coming, so it'll be tapered a bit, but then it's also understanding your regulations. And for instance, understanding your local government area isn't just a blanket rule to say, for instance, New South Wales, minimum 450 square metres. If you've got the access and you can plonk it in a 60 metre squared pad, then you can put it in there more or less. Moreton Bay as an example, and our team's job is to literally understand what is the specifics within that market. So understand, are they pro granny flats? If so, what are the regulations? What are their minimum side access? What is their minimum restrictions at the rear? Understanding that, getting the actual review within the local government area website and actually getting a printout of it to know exactly what this property therefore measures out, using your tools to measure those distances. So know if it's minimum 5 metre access, then actually make sure you've got 5 metre access.
Paul, what's a general rule of thumb for granny flat properties, say in the southeast region of Logan and say Ipswich? What are the general rule of thumbs? Because everyone seems to think they may have a granny flat property, they may not. What are we looking for so we can make a very quick assumption that we've got a granny flat property?
Minimum 600 for Moreton Bay, I'd say just put it out there. And if you're going anything less, you're dancing with fire. 5 metre access would be something that I'd be looking at. There is less access that you can get away with, but if you haven't got minimum 5 metre access in Moreton Bay, you're probably going to struggle. Ipswich, they are gazetting changes there. It'll probably be minimum 800 square metres. So, and Logan's going to be quite similar. I think 700 square metres from memory, might be 750. But there is going to be minimums there. So effectively more is more. But in turn as well, I think mentioned walk score. That's a big one for me for granny flats, because majority, you've got to think about who's renting this property when you do construct it. And most of the time, they're going to be someone who is in a granny flat for that reason, that they've probably got affordability issues. They also want something that's convenient but low maintenance. So ideally, it needs to be well located. And if it's not well located, but it's got the space, it doesn't mean that it's going to be appropriate for a granny flat. So making sure you know what amenities are nearby, and is building a granny flat there going to be something that's actually going to be tenanted and give you that same amount of vacancy rate. So understanding that, and then going and doing all your checks, easement checks, flood overlays, bushfire overlays, understanding your zoning, understanding as well as what's happening there from a soil testing, and then what is that going to cost to construct, because ultimately X amount in easements, making sure that you know exactly what you have to construct, going and getting it costed. There can be differences of 30, 40, 50 grand in that exact same product in each one of these different markets. So there's so many different levels I think you need to be familiar with, but starting with council and then working your way down is going to be a very similar way that we would do it.
And then in terms of capitalisation, right? So we always talk about granny flats in relation to cash flow, but I guess, you know, the other thing is looking at the market and saying, well, if I do spend $150,000 on a granny flat, what does that mean in terms of my end value of that particular product? Is it viable to do that?
Absolutely, and I think that's the big one, is it actually going to give you any better ROI? And this is the big one. I think if you've got a $150,000 construction and you're factoring in let's say a 30% construction loan deposit, call it somewhere around about 40,000 of your cash and or equity, then the question must be asked, is this money better off funneled into your next investment? Because if you're going to get an extra $2,000 or $3,000 a year cash flow, is that going to change your ability for the bank to lend you more money? Most likely not. If it's going to tip you over the edge, you'd be running pretty red-lined anyway. And then secondly, are you at the end of your investing or at the start of your investing? And I think granny flats for me personally make a lot of sense when you're at that phase of maximising cash flow and you want to inject cash into your portfolio. But if you're in the capital growth phase, accumulation phase, for me it's probably more so something I'd hold off doing to later down the track.
Yeah, I suppose, Paul, having the numbers in front of an investor, that sort of helps, in the sense that a general approach which I take is a balance sheet and the profit and loss approach, right, as an accountant, I suppose. So I look into a particular sort of an investment and I say that each investment is more of a business unit as such. So I've got this particular property and this is the market value and this is the overall, the cash flow, yeah? So if I do construct on that property, whether it's a granny flat, whether it's a demolition, we build a whole number of properties in there, what was my initial net asset value, and after the construction, what's my net asset value? That's the balance sheet approach. That did I have an uplift on my asset value side of it? And then at the same time, I look through the P&L side of it as well, that, well, this particular property, I had 80% LVR, and this was sort of the balancing bottom line profit or out of pocket. And after I do all those sort of a construction as such, is my cash flow increasing? Or my cash flow is more or less same, and making decision on that basis. The other comment which I also say is that the council allows you to do a granny flat, or you do have a permission to go up to 21 metres height and so forth. Doesn't necessarily mean that the market is ready. Yeah, so you know, those sort of Deception Bay and Kippering, Moreton Bay is probably a classic example, Paul.
Yeah, probably the last comment I'd make on it is really when it comes down to what you end up doing from the question you asked earlier about diversification is a granny flat, what it does to a property is effectively eradicate a whole bunch of potential buyers for that property as that next step. Now, I'm pro granny flats personally if they're done right and in the right markets at the right time, but if you're trying to play a defensive position on a property that you've built a granny flat on and potentially do want to sell that particular asset as part of your plan, if that market's not at fever pitch, that is going to be the last property that you'll be able to sell unless you're going to take a massive discount on that property, because ultimately you take out all the owner-occupiers, majority of them, you'll only be selling that property to potentially an investor as that next on
risk, right?
Absolutely, so it has to fit.
Nigel, can I ask a question of the panel, and maybe get everyone to make a quick comment on it? But as an average punter, once I've decided on the type of property that I want to buy in the area, I jump on the internet and start looking. I guess as professionals, once you get a brief from a client, is that still the first thing that you do? Is that still the first thing that you do individually as professional buyers? Or what's the first thing that you do once you've got a brief, Jay? Start with you.
For me, the actual asset selection is the very last piece of the puzzle.
Yep.
So once we identify, say, a suburb we're going to target, I use a free tool actually called home.id, which has got a suite of products that look at local government area mapping. And there's one that's called atlas.id, which is an interactive map where you can have a look at where's the higher concentration of housing commission in a suburb, which streets, which pockets. Where's the higher concentration of higher income earners or owner-occupiers? And I start building what I call the golden triangle of a suburb, which is anywhere between this point, this point, this point. It's usually not the shape of a triangle, but I call it a golden triangle. And then any property that comes up in our target price point and target criteria, then that's what I want to purchase. Yeah. So we get really down into the suburb and street. Yeah, home.id, and they've got I think 4 products: profile.id, forecast.id, which looks at population forecast for a suburb, and it's got an interactive map as well, and you can see where the congregation of that population forecast, where it's going to be targeted.
That's yeah, I'm learning something. That's good.
Incredibly powerful tool.
What's the first thing that you do once you've got the brief?
So once I've got the brief, it's a matter of, well, it depends on the budget range. So it's then identifying those areas where their budget fits in, but then it's also identifying which area suits what their end goal is. So if it's a capital growth, if it's cash flow, or if it's a combination of both, then identifying which of those regions. Then from that region, it's a matter of finding what the best type of property in that region is. So it's sort of finding the region first, then the type of property, rather than the property and then finding the region. So that's sort of
Well, yeah, we'll often have deals on the run, on the go, so we can almost like fit into the brief that's been received. So there might be a cash flow deal, like Christine said, and there might be a property that is yielding 5.5%, 6.5%, and we can allocate that property to that particular client. Or if it's a development type of situation and they're looking to subdivide, then we look at that particular deal that we've got in place, and then look to convert that client onto that one.
Look, probably from our side of things, with regards to when we actually have isolated certain criteria, strategies, property types, then markets that we will look at within property types, our team's job is to literally get on the phone. Probably realestate.com gets used about once every 6 months in our office, and that's more so just to look at our own property and dream about property more than actually investing in property. But from our own personal perspective, really looked at probably 19 out of every 20 purchases we make are off market, and that's the intention. Is that's really what, when the rubber hits the road, we need to get on the phones with our contacts to say, here's what we are really looking for. I mean, for instance, Scott's flying to Brisbane first thing tomorrow morning to go through about 24 odd properties in a day, and out of that, majority of them are just off-market options, which we're just looking at. And then I think he's dreading what the next day consists of. But I mean, that's really, I think, the part that we value a lot is the data is great for us, but we look at data so often that we kind of already know, and data, again, is something that will tell us we kind of know the markets which we know are going to be the markets. And then from there is such a big variation between a good property that's an investor grade price point and etc. versus exactly the same property in the same market, which potentially could be $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 above comparable sale price and not have the same settlement conditions and everything else that we want as part of it. So that's really where we try to extract the actual value out of the deal.
You've recently, and we had a chat about this yesterday, you've picked up a few commercial deals, right? So the research that goes into a commercial brief, and do you want to just talk about some of the differences commercial versus residential for us? Just touch on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think no, for sure. But I think commercial for us is something that's it's a tricky one, because top line, as a residential property investor, you effectively look at a purchase price, you look at comparables, and you try to figure out whether it's going to be a property that suits you or not. Where commercial, to get true comparables for commercial properties, which are probably worth their salt, very difficult to say it's exactly like that property that sold 2 weeks ago, so therefore I can get a value of the property. A lot of the inherent value in commercial is effectively in a lease, and therefore within the actual tenant of that property, be it the business. So a lot of the work that we do is not only on the actual property, the lease itself, it's also in the work that we do with our lawyers in the background. And that's the part that we spend probably 4 or 5 times longer in discussions about the lease, the inclusions of the lease, renegotiations of exclusions, inclusions for settlement, and then also looking at the quality of the actual tenant themselves. And if we're on a short lease, long lease, either way, there's nothing stopping someone from going into liquidation and making that lease redundant. So understanding who is actually renting our property or potential property is a big part of where that extra investment in time goes into. And where the markets that correlate to that are sometimes completely polar opposite to what correlates to good residential investment markets. And just because we're buying in certain markets in from residential, we're probably not buying in any of those markets in commercial right now.
Yeah, definitely. And I remember Munzeril, you were excited about a couple of deals, and Munzeril was talking to me about some commercial purchases, and you dug a little bit deeper into one and you thought, it wasn't what it seemed. Do you want to just share that story?
I mean, there's a time and place for it. There's a time and place for commercial property. Commercial property to me is all about the yield. Commercial property to me can also potentially be manufactured growth as well, whether it's a mezzanine floor, whether it's to create the more space as such. Commercial property to me is all about the tenancy and the quality of the tenancy that you cite. Commercial property to me also is more in terms of the gross return and the net return. So your gross return could very well be about 10 or 12%, but by the time you take some of those really expensive costs, the cost could be very, very low. So it's about doing the calculation very carefully, but the cycle comes in as well, because I've sort of had few commercial property in Sydney and now in Melbourne. And I bought in Sydney a number of years ago when the net return was about 8.5%. It made sense. Now I look back, some of those sort of commercial property, they're sort of sitting about 4.5%, 5% as a net. Now it just doesn't make sense. The interest by itself is about 5.5% more. And if I look back in Melbourne, is that I bought a couple recently, and the Melbourne, the net return seems to be about 10% or more, right? Commercial property has got its element of risk. Once you have a tenant, you've got a tenant for longer term, generally speaking. If you don't have a tenant, you also don't have a tenant for a longer term as well, right? So there is a time and place for it. The one question from Luke's point of view that I'm sort of very curious is that you spoke about the council a couple of times, right? So you spoke about in terms of researching with council. So if I've got a particular property and I want to understand all the potential of this particular property, what are the research that I do with the council to understand what can I do and when?
So you want to be speaking, call through to council, or you can actually go and visit council, speak to the town planner about the potential development that you can do on that particular property, and then look at anything that's going to be affecting that particular development. So watch out for things. I've seen experiences where people weren't sure about road widening, so watch out for that sort of situation. Obviously easements we talked about earlier. And just a range of things like the granny fat situation on the space and various things, and then just whatever, what's going on with infrastructure around the area, and if it's going to that property is actually going to be suited to subdivide it or put that granny flat on there. So that's probably the over. Yeah.
Also, then we've got some time for some questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would you consider having commercial property in your portfolio? Is it it doesn't feel that attractive based on what you're saying? But is it out of boredom? Is that diversifying the commercial, or there's no risk?
Yeah, it's a good question. If I look at the clients we've got in our books looking for commercial right now who suit, one in particular is a cash buyer who's moving closer to retirement, and we're ideally probably looking for minimum 6, 7, 8 year lease plus for them. So effectively, and it's probably going to be a 7-figure purchase where ideally it's looking for a cash flow play, no capital growth. Essentially, as part of the algorithm, it's basically just looking at funding cash flow and looking at some minimum requirements of 6, 7% there to fund their longevity. Other clients who probably have property portfolios which potentially have diversification into markets we're comfortable with from a resi perspective, but don't necessarily see opportunity for more residential investment in those same markets given they've got the correct amount of exposure. However, they're probably maybe a little bit skinny on cash flow and have available equity. Then from there, it's also looking at, I know we spoke yesterday, Ross, about APRA changing restrictions on lending regulations right now is specific to residential. It's not specific to commercial. So actual APRA's regulations on commercial doesn't exist. So you might also find that the actual ability for you to fund or find finance becomes very restricted in residential. But if you've got capacity or want to keep pushing, commercial is another opportunity market where you don't find those same headwinds. Funding's a bit more expensive, but also it needs to fit that cash flow scenario. So for me, it really is moving into that phase of how do you cash flow a larger portfolio, and then also making sure you select the correct asset. Boredom's it's a word that I use a lot in our office because I think sometimes people do get a bit bored of saying I've got a lot of buy and hold strategy properties and I'm sick of thinking I'm going to wait for 20 years to be rich.
Try something new.
Yeah, but and this is property, and I'm pretty blatantly honest with it, is that if you're not prepared to buy and hold and play the long-term game in property in general, it's just not the assets for you. But commercial in particular, I much more liken it to saying it's that next level after you've got exposure that really suits what you're trying to achieve and getting in as much as you should have in those markets at that time.
You could find also that with commercial, where they're located sometimes, there might be a development potential on them because they're often close to services or other shopping centres and things like that. So could have an uplift in future in terms of that commercial property.
Yeah, depending on your circumstances, and I've got clients who would only invest in commercial property, and I've got clients who would not invest in commercial property at all. It's about I suppose, what are the priorities? So it's the longer term lease, it's the guaranteed lease, provided that the tenant are there, but whether there is growth. But at the same time, as he said, is that you can manufacture the growth in the sense that commercial property is all about the floor space. So if we have that much floor space,
could be easily rezoned as well because it's closer to.
That's right. So I think we're quickly running out of time. So I might just go around the 4 panelists, if I may, and just one last tip from you guys' point of view in terms of how do we research like a pro?
Research. I think you can't, there is the analysis paralysis, but I think you need to understand why you're buying a property in a certain market, what's happening in that market. Even when you engage a buyer's agent, I always share with my clients as much knowledge and much tips and tricks along the way because I think it's important. You as a buyer, you need to understand why you're buying in that market and why you're buying at that type of property at that price point to suit your personal circumstances. So I think it's important that you understand.
Excellent. Christine, one last tip.
Research is not only statistics, but it's on the ground experience. So getting out, walking the streets, talking to the local agents, and a lot of millennials kind of accept a lot of what's online as factual, understand who's writing the information and the perspective, do they have a balanced opinion, and it's not just from one perspective. So research has got to be a holistic
Very
approach.
good point. Look,
I'd say just start working on your negotiation skills because I think that's half the deal. So do the research, obviously, and then work on the negotiation skills with the agent because it's vitally important.
and Paul, if I may.
I'll probably take a different spinner on this, but I'm very pro advice, paid advice, and I personally don't do my own home loans. I don't do my own accounts. I don't repair my car, and I'm pro advice for people who do it as a living. Personally speaking, I think there's ways to mitigate risk, and engaging people to do different parts of what you do and how to create wealth, regardless what facet it is. Choosing someone who is actually tried, trusted, and understands how to get a certain part of what you're trying to achieve done in a quicker, more successful way is going to pay itself back in dividends.
Surrounding yourself with a team is the big thing.
Yeah, and I think surrounding yourself with a team, but understanding, and I think the research for these guys comes in, even as I said before, even if they engage a professional, understanding the reasons and seeing it for themselves, right, just gives that added level of comfort, rather than, because at the end of the day, they're not going to be the ones that sort of come and bail you out, when you've got a property that's gone down in value. So it has to be your decision at the end of the day, and having, I guess, tools complemented with a team is something that goes a long way.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to say thank you to everyone, guys. We've been very, very, very blessed to have all of you in there. There's a number of things that I personally learned today with number of research, and they will hang around with any other questions from the audience perspective. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, plenty of stuff there that we learned today, which was good. So thank you very much, Jay, Luke, Christine, Paul. They will be around to answer some of your questions. Guys, you've got these forms here. This is for us to obviously present these seminars the way you want them, and present the information that you want to hear. So, guys, if you could fill this out, get it back to Diana at the back there, or Christine. Guys, if you want that free RP data report, pop your email address, pop your address in, and one of the team here can organise that RP data report to be forward to your email in due time. Also, guys, a couple other things. We are not having a seminar in July. We're going to give you a little bit of a break. Origin and World Cup, so everybody can recharge. We will be returning back on the 21st of August. What we are doing in the background is we are finally coming up to the 21st century as a team. Lots of things are happening on YouTube channels. We're getting a lot of resources and medias out there on our website. So visit our website. We're going to be adding lots and lots of learning, education material on there. Clips from the seminars as well. There might be some cameos from Munzrul and Ross and Scott, maybe a little one from myself. But we are getting there. We are going to throw a lot of information out there, so it's easily and accessible for you guys to get onto and read any time. Next seminar being 21st of August. Obviously, bring a friend. We will be wrapping up a couple of things. But guys, don't forget, fill in this, get your property address to us, and we can get you that free RP data report. Enjoy.
Thanks. Beautiful.